Hello, my name is Brandon Sills, and today I am presenting to you Stars and Ponies by Ola Englund, the synthesizer edition. Uh, if you're tuning in right now at this point, chances are this is a premiere, and this is also happening shy of the next Sunday with Ola. So if you're a fan of Ola Englund, if you came here because of him, you'll probably get a chance to tune into Sunday with Ola number 32, I believe, as soon as this is over. So let's get to the meat and bones of this whole entire deal. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, at least from my perception, reading all the comments, in terms of the synthesizer element to the song. And so I wanted to do this as sort of a bonus thing for the fans of that song, as well as those that are curious to see kind of how the process of all of this happened. So if I kind of lock up a little bit here and there, it's just me trying to on the fly think and articulate as appropriately as possible. So let's jump right into this then. First thing first is we have an audio file here. I will be playing this shortly. This was what I came up with on a Twitch live stream back in about the summertime of 2020. And it was a request to do something for Ola to jam out to on his Twitch live stream, like in the beginning or something, when he's just kind of like and getting the audience to kind of come rolling in before he started playing some tunes and everything. And by the time that I had gotten all of this together, this was just like the first demo version of it. He enjoyed it so much that he wanted to chop it up and arrange it to fit sort of like the structure of an actual song, and wanted it to be part of what becomes included with the next album due out next year, which is called Starzinger. And so this whole entire thing was quite a quick, I guess, if you will, like a blindsided kind of a thing, because I wasn't expecting to be told that it was going to be album material. And because of that opportunity, I can't thank Ola enough on top of thanking all of you for that feedback on that single. And that's just a lot of love. So we're going to start with the bonus here. To give you a perspective, I'm using Studio One Professional version number 5. I chose this program specifically because I wanted something that was going to a degree, challenge me while also having a couple of aces up my sleeve for making extra added effects on specific instruments and all that kind of stuff. I'm not exactly familiar with this DAW by any given means, so it was a perfect opportunity to push myself a little bit and try writing something in an environment that's kind of alien enough to me. So, with that being said, this is the first thing I'm going to show you, and it is the first rough draft that I sent to Ola before becoming chopped up and getting arranged and figuring out where everything else kind of sits as far as what you hear on the single now. And this is just raw by all means, not the all the same notes, the same approach to everything. It's just it's dry, so it doesn't sound like it has all of the extra production added on for the single specifically. So this is a legit first rough draft. So that was the first demo that was developed. Now it's definitely different because the mid section that kind of happens here was sort of inspired by like the 1980s Terminator kind of a vibe. I wanted to add something a little bit different into the whole demo phase of things. The bulk of it outside of that though is pretty much like a good like cut copy paste kind of thing that does show up in the final product. And my process with adding this little midsection in was because if it already sounded kind of dark and a little bit spacey to a degree, but also dramatic in a way, I wanted to have a little bit more of like a suspense kind of a idea there. And in the end, it didn't exactly work for the idea in mind as far as composing the song and adding all of the guitar chugs, the cleans, and all that kind of stuff. So that was omitted from the final, but the remainder of everything stayed in place. And there is a good reason to why is because a majority of that content outside of that midsection there, like everything was pretty rock solid for the composition. It had the vibe, it had the feel. The midsection, I would assume at this point, it kind of made things either fall apart or it just was a little too intense or too dramatic of a change in the key and the structure and whatnot. So I understand that completely, but the remainder of everything does lend itself pretty solid. So we have that, and then the remainder of everything that's here is a good chunk of what did make it in the end. There is at least one little section right here that repeats basically what's the midsection down here, and some of the other instrumentation was omitted. And I don't think any of it is there in my graveyard, so to speak. Some extra elements or some parts and ideas that did belong over here probably needed some extra reworking of some sort. So whenever I do kind of work on some of this stuff, I do kind of on the side have a graveyard area in a project. So if you have an idea of some sort and it either sounds like it works or you just need to have like a reference of some sort, always put a chunk of it in the graveyard rather than just deleting it permanently because it could come in handy later or it could be useful in another project that you could start up on. And you can do this in any DAW. You just want to make sure you do it as far enough away from the main part of the project. And yeah, so with that, what ended up being for the most part on the end, I believe this was one of the other approaches to everything that I did for like a more final update as far as everything's concerned. But I do know that these two melody layer parts right here were omitted. I think the synth bass at the end was completely different in terms of the key or however it was done. Uh, and we'll go over that in a little bit. But now I'll play you this version, which was, I believe, a very, very final before sending it off as well. And let's do this. So we can stop right there. So the differences between the two versions are pretty drastic because the audio file itself here is an original demo getting chopped up and organized, and comparing it to this version just played. The few things that are there are that a good chunk of this at the top end was based on what was there as an idea on top of um arranging in the way that at the least here, we're going to open up some of this stuff here real quick because it's going to make better sense doing this. So the melody part here as sort of a good introduction, and then as an extra layering here, and then another one over here. I think over here is like a 3-octave deal. I don't really recall. So we have all of that, and then we have this little chunk right here that kind of helps accent the synth bass and another pad that's kind of there. But as far as the synth bass part's concerned, let's move into the main verse area, if we will, where all of the guitar stuff actually starts happening. So you see some of these deviations here, and I'll actually pull up this right here. I still don't know how to work this DAW. There. Okay, so some of the notation here kind of goes around a little bit with what I was able to perceive from the guitar parts that were going on, and it kind of bounces around a little bit. Now, in some other elements or aspects of it here, it does kind of do the same in other places, and it kind of follows in suit just because I figured, well, if anything, it may actually help everything out and work a lot better. But we still went with some of the basic kind of form, like these files right here, like these parts are doing. And layering is key here as far as a project like this is concerned. So I'm going to give you a little inspection of how all of the layering kind of works with an approach, or like a sort of a genre like this, if you will. So we're going to just go through part for part per track kind of thing, and I'll explain a little bit more down the line here. I'm going to just start it out with this. So you have that, but there's also variations that are kind of injected in there, and we'll go over those in a little bit. But now when we add another layer, let's actually start beforehand so you can hear it kind of kick in. So there is kind of a miss note there because of some of the techniques I was trying to utilize here for this song specifically, and that kind of is an unfortunate thing, but at least they're easy to fix. Now, when we come back into it at the very end of the song, let's see here. I can just unmute this item, probably just do this, and no. I'm stupid. So let's go with that, and let's do this again there. This should work. So you get the dual layer, and then you wind up getting the full 3 layers at the end. So if you notice that extra little layer there, so it's kind of like a high, sort of like a, I would want to say a saxophone or something like that. I don't remember, but we're going to dive into that. Um, so yeah, when you have all of those extra layers going on, you really fatten up the sound or bring some form of life to it. So we're going to go over that in a little bit. The next part is the synth bass. Now, this may not be, in some parts, it may not be the version that you hear on the single, but uh, for the synth bass part, I wanted to do some of the layering to, and not only have some of the old qualities of vintage equipment kind of a idea, but also sort of bring something else to life with it. We'll go over the instruments in a minute, but I'll give you the separate layers piece by piece and then in combination. And then the other layer. Now together. So the reason why I went with 2 layers for synth bass, one was to sort of have like a really sharp, almost metallic kind of a vibe while being carried with the more subby kind of side of everything, with a little bit of that kind of retro synth bass that most people would probably design on their first synthesizer compared to the other one. But they worked so decently together that they also kind of helped carry some of that mood along with everything. The next part is more or less a growl pad, and it kind of works in the sense of it gives atmosphere, even if it's at a lower register or if it's maybe even an octave above the bass, roughly. The idea for it is to help bring in some form of movement while the synth bass is going and while everything else kind of starts adding up. And this is what that pad sounds like. And so forth. Now, to bring that pad some sort of life, aside from just the way that the notation worked out, if I expand this track, you'll see some of these lines kind of hiding in the background. So that's just automation of the mod wheel feature for the plugin. And that kind of helps bring in some of that sharpness that you hear as it's moving along, sort of like motion to give character. And we'll come back to that instrument as well in a little bit. The next part is this, which I believe was more or less just kind of like a soft upper pad or meant to be that. And there's some automation for that last little part there, volume to kind of help fade it out, to give an idea of that it's meant to do that. This next little part here, a little kind of, I guess, if you will, like a cherry on top for atmosphere, was more or less just an ambient piano kind of a thing. And then this other little thing, one thing I definitely would have liked to seen more in the song were these FM bells. I don't remember exactly where I started coming up with the idea to implement these in some of the like synthwave ish projects or whatever this genre realistically is. I know there's like 4 names for it, but this was one of those things that I wanted to design for like dramatic effect. Now, even though it starts out sharp and then it starts to kind of fade out a little bit and then it becomes a little bit more resonant to whatever extent at the tail end of it, these kinds of frequency modulation or FM synth bells, I wanted to have something that sounded dramatic as a hit. And that was kind of what I always go to when I think about I want to have something like this as like an impact rather than layering up some other stuff, including drums, in order to give some sort of an impact. And we'll get to that instrument as well in a minute. There was a little couple of things that I added on the final version to try to kind of like weasel it in, but it didn't exactly take. So there's this little thing that I did here, monophonic, and it starts with a lower octave and sweeps up to an octave above. And it's sort of to a degree like an imitation of toe down with a whammy pedal, and it would have worked with the guitar parts without a problem, but I think it probably at the end it didn't really work itself out that well, or it just added too much to the section, so it was omitted from what I can tell. But this is just that. So it would kind of add some weight underneath the harmonics of the guitar in performance at a part like that. What else do we have here? Okay, so that's basically all that there is in terms of the parts. The stuff that's in the graveyard isn't really important. And so let's dive in to some of these other layers here. Let's start with this layer right here. Melody layer number 1. Let's open up the instrument. So I may have started at the bass patch for jump and modified it. If I have an asterisk there, it's probably the fact that I modified it. So you can find a preset in any synthesizer plugin just like this, and you can tweak it to kind of fit your mood or your style. And that's to a degree what happened here. So one of the things that I look for when coming to patches like this, or at least trying to design them, is if I want something sharp and plucky, filter envelope and your loudness envelope in the OBXA is going to be your best friend here, as well as figuring out how much of the sustain on the filter you want to have if you don't want to completely bottom out. But if you still want to retain some of the character, adding some of the modulation in roughly about this much. A little bit of resonance doesn't hurt either. Keeping it on 4-pole, which, if I remember correctly, equates to 24 band low pass filter. And finding a specific area in the frequency knob to kind of give you a little bit of the bottom out, but not too much, to where that sharp character is a little bit more muted. You can go a little bit lower if you want to have a little bit more of it, which is what I opted for the instrument. Go just a little bit higher. And most of the other stuff here, I didn't really tweak much with the modulation or the oscillators. Master and voices don't need to tweak with them either. And there was one of these two lids. I don't really tweak with some of the under the hood stuff here as far as that's concerned. The next step for this was the effects chain. I believe the compressor was one of the few things that I left on. The multi-mode filter, I think, it was to kind of take out some of the low end information and kind of mix in just a little bit of that high pass going on while still kind of retaining some of it, but taking enough of it out, or at least kind of messing with it in order to somewhat thin it out, which kind of helps it stand out. And just a slight amount of chorus in order to give it just a little bit of width, not too much, but just enough to, help further make it stand out. So with that, let's move on to the next layer. And this seems like it's another one. So I found a patch again that I like the sound of, but I wanted to mess with it just a little bit more. And this seems to be the result of that. So if I remember this correctly, I didn't really do way too much tweaking with the filter and the loudness, but I did to a certain degree deal with the filter and nothing with the oscillators and all the other stuff. I usually tend to more or less mess with the oscillators if I'm wanting to change the pitch of one of them, or if I want to thin it out a bit, if it's pulse or square wave, basically. The filter and the envelopes for both amplitude, loudness, or filter are the two things I sometimes tend to mess with a little bit more. And there was nothing else under the hood that I messed around with. And for this, also, there was a bit of overdrive, chorus, and reverb. So the overdrive mix in just a little bit, kind of gives it a bit of sharpness, but not too much. And it kind of cleans up the tone just a touch. A little chorus in order to give it some width, or at least some width type information, but it's not too apparent. And then reverb, there's just a little bit. Not too much, but it gives it some sort of space, so it has some sort of definition. Oops. Okay, let's learn our DAWs. And then layer number 3. Let's zoom in just a little bit more here. So this one was done with a Korg M1 plugin. Uh, if I remember correctly, I just used the trumpet patch, or no, maybe I just used all. 3 clicks, and you actually know what the sound is like. But for this, cross delay was buried as an effect, and ensemble hall was turned off completely. It was too much information going on, so it was just too much space, too much width, and I wanted to have at least a little something, but not be too apparent. So the dry wets turned down to basically 4 out of, I believe, 127, or fully wet or whatever. Let's see here. Wait. Okay, so it just goes 100 and wet. Okay. Uh, One thing you can do is double click and type in your value. So I didn't do anything significant with this. I think just took some of the effects out and didn't really dabble too much with the way that the easy tab works. Didn't do anything with the oscillator. Don't think I did anything with the filter stage. Definitely didn't do anything with the amplitude part. So just kind of like pick a random patch, whether or not if it's combination, multi, or program, and you just open up the browser and find everything where you want it. Pretty nifty plugin. Definitely gives some of those sounds that you're looking for from time to time. But it's kind of a rompler, and it was damn good at what it was doing at the time, and that in itself lended the extra layer. So with that, let's just kind of add them in part for part, and you'll get a chance to finally hear everything individual and brought in as a full layer. And that concludes the melody layers. the synth layers for bass parts. This is where it gets interesting. So I opted in for the Roland System 8 plugin, and I did own one of these originally, the original hardware piece. Kind of regret selling it a while back, but now that I have a good idea of how it works in plugin format, I may wind up getting another one in the future. When is key, or I could just continue using the plugin because the plugin is about 1 to 1. So what happens when you start this plugin is it normally starts you out with just a basic patch, and I think it's the System 8 saws. And as a default patch, I tend to kind of sit there and see exactly what it is and what I can do to kind of fix it up a little bit. So I'm looking for a sound like that typically with my synth bass, but that just wasn't enough. But I knew that this was going to be the weight that kind of helps hold everything as it goes along. And to get this kind of a sound, I use super saws on both oscillators and kind of give it a little bit of color, which really for super saw with the System 8, it just adds more detune or like a super saw kind of effect and balancing it in however you see fit, along with adjusting the filter envelope and how much of that envelope is being affected completely. And for the synth bass, I guess I chose a low pass filter at 18 decibels per octave. So that's kind of like, I guess, three pole, if you will. But it definitely helps because where it's set, you still get some of that high information while you still get a lot of that low. But for this specific instrument, there's also some high pass filter introduced. So you get rid of a lot of that subbiness if I'm able to do this just right to give an example. So you notice how when I dial that high pass filter all the way down to 0, you get more of that low end information. And then when I undo it and bring it back up to the value that it was at, you lose some of it, but you still get some of that sound. This is definitely perfect for something if you're going to have a lot of bass heavy information coming up in the song somewhere. And to me, it was the drums, the guitar, and the bass guitar. So having some of that information taken out definitely helps when you're trying to mix it down the line. And then the next one, we are using Zebra 2. Now, if I remember this one correctly, I added some oscillator effects while also kind of randomly drawing in and using some of the preset information that's available as far as your waveforms. For oscillator one, I opted for GeoBlend, and for oscillator two, Geomorph. Geomorph is kind of like the basic go to. It allows you to dial in your saw or your square, your triangle, but you can't really get the sine wave. You have to do that, I believe, with GeoBlend or SpectroBlend. But with oscillator one using GeoBlend, you can kind of dial in whatever waveforms you want to draw in. And then if you're on oscillator 1 or 16, or basically consider it a wavetable, to correct myself here, as a wavetable with 16 different waveforms, you can draw them in and kind of morph them around to a point where you can get something a little bit more harsh, maybe, or something a little bit more harsher on a different level, or you can have something somewhat rounded, not by too much. And I opted in for oscillator one to have wrap and brilliance, and just kind of dialing that around gives you a little bit of an idea here. Let's take oscillator two out real quick and play back. So that's what oscillator sounds like alone. And then oscillator two. So it sounds a little bit wider and a little bit weirder. And that's because of exophase and fractals. But when you blend everything together, and along with distortion and the fourth filter available, because you have the ability to add four different filter stages. Considering it's semi-modular, this is the end result. So it has that sharpness sort of like right up the middle, but some of that extra information from oscillator 2 adds a sense of stereo width, even if it's just straight up the middle. I don't remember if this was going out in stereo or whatever, but it sounded great, so I wanted to do something with that, and that was a result of that. Now, let's move on to the next little part here, which is adding these 3 things together, and then we'll get to one of the other fun little things, which is this yellow stuff up here. But, uh, for the Grout Pad, let's see here. Yeah, the Grout Pad, I used Endless Flight and or not really modulated it, but, more like modified it so that it kind of worked in favor the way that I needed it to in order to create some of that growl and still have some of that extra, maybe like low mid range information to give weight to the movement. And again, I typically don't mess too much with oscillators and modulation. However, I believe the mod wheel itself, or at least to say the mod stick, affected more or less the filter stage of things because it sounded relatively quiet in terms of the sharpness. But when you start moving the mod stick around, or at least let's say the mod wheel, you get a different character out of it. And if I actually give you an example of this, let's see here. So you notice the stick moving, and that's because of the automation. So that's how I wanted to create some of that movement for this patch. And the original patch itself was based off of a pad, from what I recall, was a very similar sound used from 1984's Terminator film. Brad was pretty legit when it came to the composition of that soundtrack, or at least to say even the film score. And some of those kinds of sounds, when played in an even lower register, sounds exactly like how it sounded for back then. And that's one of those things that I've been wanting to utilize for quite some time. Combine that with this one, the soft intro, if I remember correctly, was the Yamaha CS80. So I believe I just randomly found a patch that sounded like it worked and modified some of the parameters accordingly. And I'm not really familiar with the way of the CSV or the CS80's architecture. I'm not really familiar with how everything kind of flows into each other, but to me it was I wanted to have something like this as like another piece of the vintage to add to that flavor that the song itself provided as far as the synth element. The FM bell, since it's right there, was utilized with Native Instruments FM8. So I'm not entirely a professional by any means with FM synthesis, but on a specific level here, what I wanted was something similar to that of the Yamaha YM2612 chip, which is part of what's used for the audio processing of the Sega Genesis and most of the arcade games that were in those cabinets with the TVs in them. So I understand a bit of how that architecture kind of works because it's four operator. And operators in FM synthesis are basically, to a degree, the same way that you can approach two or three oscillators in an analog synthesizer. They function in such a way, though, where as operators, you're using waveforms and just modulating, and you're able to create all these metallic kind of sounds. And that's a reason why these four are kind of feeding into each other in a very specific way. It may not be unique in terms of a custom algorithm because the Yamaha DX7 and the DX21 were synthesizers that utilize algorithms to feed operators into each other in a very specific way to achieve some of these sounds. And instead, I don't think I Well, apparently I didn't use operator B. Doesn't seem like it. Let's find out. Ooh, wait. Yep, okay, so I didn't use operator B, which would have if I had it enabled. Okay, so that could have actually added something. That's with all 6 operators going, and then with just the 4 to imitate sort of the Sega Genesis kind of an approach. So you get a lot of that really harsh kind of initial transient, and it starts to kind of fade out and bring in some very subtle change of character. And then it kind of in a way feels extreme when most of that harshness fades out. But to me, it felt like a Sega style kind of a sound like that, even if harsh, could sound like a bell that could add drama and maybe a little bit of weight. So if you hear that in the mix, which I'm pretty sure you might not, but if you heard that in the mix for in the original song, that probably would have added a little bit more character to it. But regardless, the instrument that replaced that, or at least was layered over the top of it, um, there was a couple of elements that I'll explain a little bit later. I at least want to make sure I'm not missing anything here. This ambient piano was processed through a Roland D50 and then further affected by effects plugins and whatnot. But I wanted to have something like a little bit subtle on the top that added maybe a little bit of air and a little bit of like a mystery or like an not really an ominous feeling, but something sort of suspenseful and still dramatic. And in the end, when it came out, like I knew that having that dry wasn't gonna cut it, so I had to add a couple of other things to it in order to give it that sort of mystery, that tension, that drama. But at the same time, with the way that it plays out, I might be wrong in saying this, but it also feels like it adds like a sense of hope kind of a vibe somewhere in there. And to me, it worked out pretty well. Let's see here. We go down the line here to this one, which was omitted from my knowledge at least. We're using Omnisphere 2.6. I believe I just pulled up a random patch of some sort, tweaked some of the parameters a little bit, and all I did at the end was just monophonic synth and a little bit of glide to give it some of that movement to sort of imitate a whammy pedal. And as far as that's concerned, those are the synthesizer instruments that are used to create these layers, along with some of the compositional factor that we'll go into in a minute as well. So next up, drums. You always got to have those 80s vibe kind of drums in order to give that vibe along with it. Now, these were affected at the end result for the single, so you'll hear them kind of in the background a little bit spacey, but if you hear it in the beginning here, just on its own. So the crash cymbals samples that I have, they don't really ring out so much. So if I remember this one correctly, the crash cymbal had a little bit of reverb added to it in order to kind of give it a little extra tail and a little bit of a room kind of a vibe. And the toms also had a little bit of a gated reverb kind of action going on. The remainder of this drum stuff, however, so that main drum beat was omitted, but the initial hit here, when it starts at measure 18, minus the hi-hats, it was just the kick and the crash cymbal. So it just kind of cuts right in, just like, and yeah, it was fun to do all that. And I think from here outward, I guarantee you this, all of the drum stuff minus the first couple of hits were omitted because, as we all know, it will not chug unless if there's real drums and guitar over it. And that's exactly what Delta Empire and Ola did perfectly for this. But with that, though, we still have some of the extra drum stuff that was left over. And then let's see what else. So a couple of the loops here and there, just to kind of make sure I have the drum beat going and kind of continue to feel the vibe of everything as it's going. Those drums in that entirety there were replaced with Delta Empire's own drumming skills, which are definitely some top quality drumming skills. And they also sound extremely phenomenal. Holy crap, I'll tell you. With that though, this was using Impact, which is provided by Presonus for the Studio One software platform, and using some of the samples that I do also have in my drive. So some of these are from Sennheiser, and some of them are from a separate library. Like Nasty Snare is a drum sample that you can find on an Alesis SR16, a Lin drum close hat, and an open hat. Sennheiser Crash. I think some of these toms were from, I want to say Sennheiser as well, but I'm not 100% sure. So don't quote me on that one. It doesn't seem like I had any other samples available. So these were just kind of like the basic samples that I was working with. Typically, when I do drum kits like this, I tend to have multiple banks because, you have 16 pads. You can't exactly use every single drum sample under the sun unless you're utilizing multiple banks. So with bank A, if I was doing something a little bit more extravagant in terms of an idea, or maybe a little more ambitious, might be a more proper term, I'll use a kick drum, a snare drum, a clap next to the snare drum. I would use the open and the closed hi-hats. I would have maybe one or two different crash cymbals, and maybe, depending, I might use a ride or a ride bell. I'd have one set of toms. So that would be kind of like my Canon toms, maybe, or more closer to kind of like halfway between Canon and toms, where they just sound big and they just sound massive and have a lot of air and just sort of this boom to them. So this sounds kind of like a hybrid of that and like a Simmons drum kit, like some of the old stuff where you get like this really sort of cheesy sounding synth tom that you might get on like a Casio kit, maybe if you're lucky. I don't know. And then I'd have a separate set of toms and maybe a couple of other extra things on the side in a B bank, so that I have access to another set of toms that sound. And I don't mean to say this in a demeaning way to the genre or the style, but like something that's a little bit more cheesy that lends itself even better to some gated reverb and maybe a little extra EQ on the side. So drum samples aren't your enemy until you don't hear the quality that you want out of it. So nasty snare for me was what I wanted to have to kind of help out in having sort of like a basic beat. And it works. If you think about the idea of also layering your drum samples, you can also fatten it up, or you can just create a completely different character out of your kick drum, your snare drum, or even your toms for that matter. So don't be afraid to experiment with your drum samples or layer them. For me, this specific project here kind of meant just being about as stripped down as possible. And then what else do we have here? So by the time that I compose all of this, and at least to say commission synth update version 3, which is what I named it, I guess. Um, so I sent that off to Ola, and then I wound up getting all of the drums, bass guitar, the guitar parts, and kind of a idea of all of the synths, just kind of like right back there, so I'd have something to look at and kind of observe, see exactly how Ola did everything by chopping up and manipulating the synth parts to fit everything. And from that information alone, I worked with all of the stuff at the top to fit exactly what was going on to the best of my ability with bass guitar and guitar. A couple of tweaks that I did for this specific version with the synth bass didn't make it to the final version, I believe, because it didn't seem like it did. And I wanted to make sure that everything sounded all right. It didn't sound dissonant by any given means. It would just be clean. And that kind of helped out being able to kind of bounce back and forth with that. Now, the outro part with the synth bass, when you hear the song kind of finish right there and start tailing off, you notice how one instrument there kind of tends to fade out the entirety of that outro, but it's based on what's happening around the beginning and giving it like some form of continuity, or at least even like what's going on at the end, minus some of the notation changes. And then there's a couple of elements that you've heard in the single and where this stuff is supposed to come in at. Let me just organize this by minimizing everything that doesn't need to be up right now. So that way we have all the room necessary. So where were we at? Okay, so the tail end and some of the other stuff that happens in the song. Let's just mute only the drums in this. And let's hear. Okay, make sure that I'm doing this just right. Because I'm sure that if I have something on mute that needs to stay mute. One of the reasons why I work in other DAWs much more efficiently. Okay, so in the song, where you hear that bell, there's something that's going on, and we're going to isolate this little chunk right here so you get an idea. Um, the way that this part progresses here, that very specific instrument, you actually hear something completely different there. And it's a liberty that was taken by Jocke Skog. And I do believe that it actually did a hell of a lot better than what this instrument did, though you probably could have also merged the two together and they still would have just been as banging. But then you wind up getting to this point here where everything starts kind of kicking in. Don't you just feel that? Doesn't that just hit you somewhere? I know it does for me. because it was such a good way to sit down and compose this idea in terms of having something sort of spacey and a little bit dramatic. Now, one thing that we can go over now at this point is in regards to something you probably saw earlier in the video or like throughout the entirety of it. The chords section here says B minor. And that was part of the request for composing this. And another hint for you here is the BPM is set at 155. So if you're familiar with the term tempo or BPM, either way it goes, 155. The compositional factor of this, it took a little bit of noodling around to kind of come up with an idea. So I wanted to come up with the melody first before adding anything else. And the melody itself kind of plays off of just this weird little noodling thing. A couple of times I've played this on my Roland Juno DI, and it doesn't exactly sound the same as this because I'm instead of going this power chord method here, which is B, F, B, I was actually kind of noodling around with B, B, and B, and then kind of playing around with this little section here. But when it comes to composing stuff like this, it's kind of just hit and miss. You have to experiment quite a bit and find something that sounds like it works. And you can either play it live while your instrument is armed, or you can just program a melody in and see if it works. You can also tap out using a MIDI controller and getting sort of like a timing for this. By chance, this all right here was more or less step input recording. So the first four notes, B, F sharp, B, and then back down an octave lower to B. To me, I feel like in a degree, it's iconic for doing this kind of thing, but there's more to it. So we're going to continue onward because this is in the B natural minor. So to explain the melody here a little bit further is when you experiment in a fixed sort of a scale, it's really kind of just your own perception of how you want to progress it, right? So this is to a degree like a little bit offbeat and a little bit bouncy, but at the same time, it still works in a 4/4 construct. So the melody, realistically, if you think about it, is B and D flat, D, D, E, D, and or yeah, D flat or C sharp, dealer's choice. And the second half of it kind of goes B, C sharp, E, and then it does a 5-note thing here with the upper octave compared to the first one. So it's B and G, F sharp, D, and E. Now there's some other variations in this down the line, especially when the key kind of changes around. So let's go here. Now there might be some dissonance in there, and that's okay. We can, work around that. Let's use our imagination. Yeah, because some of the notes definitely don't really work together the way that it was kind of saved by some freak accidents and whatnot. But by playing some of that stuff out, you kind of get yourself a chance to create a melody that you can experiment with continually because it's there, it's print, right? And you can establish your mood by establishing a melody. But the other thing too is that you can also still establish it by creating an atmosphere. And to me, melody also does establish that atmosphere as far as this project itself is concerned. So for working in B minor, that comes naturally to me because that's what I've been mostly doing since about 2002. And I can definitely say that that knowledge definitely helps out. I'm not really a professional in terms of music theory, so I just kind of know things by ear. I don't really have like the ear for everything, but Yeah. When we come to the synth bass part, so that's on a B, drops to a G, B to G right there. And then there's a couple of parts as well where G kind of is a thing, but it also gets bouncy. So let's show some of the bounciness because I'm pretty sure this didn't make the final cut. So there's a little bit of that, right? And then this little section here. Yeah, that's part of what was omitted, I believe. Let's go to this section right here. And so forth, right? Uh, let's see here. What else? Now, as far as the pad stuff is concerned, and this is where it gets probably a little bit more interesting because when you're establishing the melody and then you start establishing a bit of the bass line in order to figure out what to put in next, the pad here, more or less, was a little bit more kind of experimental in nature. And by the end, it all worked out in favor. So this is still, B minor, B, G, E, D, and then it goes back to B, jumps up to G, F sharp, A, G, F sharp, E, D, and it kind of just descends back into B. Let's fast forward to the last little part. And with that, we also have the CS80, even though it's labeled Juno 106. That was the first instrument I apparently experimented with for this. Let's rewind it back to the beginning of that part. So with this, it's kind of simple because it's fitting in just like a scale up and a scale down notation wise. Nothing chromatic in nature, just more or less like scale, sort of compressed in a way, fitting in with knowing what the notes are doing and then just kind of adding into it. So a pad to kind of add a little bit of motion and then something to kind of help in terms of perhaps like the continuity of what the pad is doing. And they play pretty well with each other. Let's just solo those two real quick. So you kind of notice that when you listen to these kinds of elements, individually, the dynamic feels to a certain extent like it changes because you hear notes together in a way that maybe you feel they shouldn't be together. But as long as you're working in the construct of a key, a mode, scale, any term you want to give this, as long as you're working within the confines of that and also kind of either A and Bing it or working together with these as you're programming it in or playing it live, you start to kind of hear some of those notes that maybe you want or maybe they don't work together. But if you transposed it by a semitone or a couple or just worked within the confines of the scale, if it allows you to lock to it, being able to merge those notes in a very specific manner can help you further to create that atmosphere. And I believe that kind of brings us to the end of this video specifically. And just remember a couple of things. Layer like layering things, not your enemy. Actually, they can enhance things if it feels like it's a little bit flat. You can add something on top to make it pop just a little bit more. And don't be afraid to layer your drum samples if you feel like you're missing something or you want to add extra weight or extra body or maybe even just a little bit of top end somewhere, and experiment with your drum beats a little bit more. Add as many samples as you feel you need for the project. And if you want to make it like over the top, use as many samples as you possibly can within the limitations of your RAM. And in any given project that you do, always create a graveyard in your project so you have data off to the side somewhere. So if something feels like it doesn't work, you can push it over there and it would still work. Kind of like how we have a SRX Brass, which is, I guess, a System 1. There was something that was completely different as far as that instrument's concerned. I think it was either the Roland D50 or something else. I'm not sure. What else do we have here? More of some of the outro stuff. So a completely different feel there, and I think that's why I put that there in the graveyard, along with the remainder of all this stuff. Now, there was a couple of things that I wanted to go over as well, real quick, because you've seen the instruments, you've seen the notation, you've seen how they all kind of play out and how they work together, and you've gotten a chance to hear some of everything done individually, so you know what the layering element of everything is like here. So there's a couple of things that I probably mentioned earlier, but I'll mention it again. So some of these elements here, like the Grout Pad, some synth or sample replacement was done by Jocke Skog, and then there's also the outro where the synth bass kind of follows suit with just like the main line here for the synth bass, and primarily that, and that little part there after the weird little thing. So it's basically just B and G. We kept just that one synth layer there, but there was also a couple of liberties that were taken for that. It was stretched out, I think, however many extra measures or whatever, and there was an extra texture that I didn't think about putting in. That was, I believe, also done either by Ola or by Jocke Skog, and that would be what the outro is with like the synth bass, like one of the layers just kind of like carrying it a little bit, adding some sort of like a completion kind of a character to it, while also having this like airy thing, like this airy texture that just sounds sort of like as if like you're meant to calm down or like you're getting a really decent breather. And having that in there at that end section, I didn't think about something like that, but it was so perfect when I got a chance to finally hear that as part of the final result. And then there's also a couple of things I believe that were done in the middle with the final version. Either Ola or Jocke did it himself. I don't know which one did. Either way it goes, all of the synth work that you hear in the song, the majority of it was indeed done by myself. You can see that here, but also a couple of additional insertion of synthesizers or textures and whatnot were done by a couple of other people. They also deserve the credit for helping to make this come to life. And I believe that brings it to the end of this video as far as things are concerned. If you were here for the premiere and just hanging out and you enjoyed this presentation, thank you very much. I will continue to answer any questions as best possible. You can leave them down in the comments, and it would mean a lot to me. If you really enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. And I'll try to do some more videos regarding this kind of stuff. Uh, yeah, so there be it. Ola Englund, Stars and Ponies. Go and check out the song if you haven't heard it yet. Go to Ola Englund's YouTube channel. I'll link it in the description. And I'll also link to the song Stars and Ponies. So yeah, check everything out. And thank you very much. And apparently now people are playing NVIDIA Steam Launcher and Cyberpunk. Hooray! I should have reminded myself to close out Steam. My bad. Oh yeah. Okay. Again, thank you so much for tuning into this video, hanging out during the premiere if you did. And I'll see you in a future video. I don't know where I'm going to go from here, but the only way to go is up. And if this video inspired you to want to do some 80s sounding kind of stuff like this, or just dabble in synthesizers and get good at it or whatever, uh, I'll try to help out in whatever way I can. You can DM me on Discord or whatever. And I'll see you again soon. I promise you that.